Welcome, everyone that's joined thus far. I think we're going to get a couple more joining in the next couple of minutes. So, and then we'll just kick off. So, good evening, everybody. My name is Beverly Freen. I'm the Vice Chair of AMIS. We are delighted to welcome you to our first AMIS webinar. As you may know, AMIS, or Abused Men in Scotland, is a charitable organisation that provides support and information services to male victims of domestic abuse and their families. We have just celebrated our 10th anniversary as a registered charity in Scotland, which we are all enormously proud of. And here's looking to the next 10 years. The purpose of today's event is to share information with you and to raise awareness of the plight of male sufferers and survivors of domestic abuse and violence. We are privileged today to have three distinguished speakers, Dr. Elizabeth Bates, Iris Kwa, and Charlie Bird, joining us. Dr. Elizabeth Bates is a senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Cumbria and is a trustee of the Mankind Initiative. She is our keynote speaker today, and she will be sharing her research on men's experience of intimate partner violence, post-separation changes, barriers to seeking help, and the importance of a gender-responsive service. Next on the agenda, we are delighted to introduce our very own AMIS Services Manager, Iris Kwa, who is a solicitor and who leads our service delivery to those who seek out our support. Iris will be presenting on systematic and systemic barriers which male victims are subjected to, and the significant negative impact on these victims. Finally, we are fortunate to have one of our valued AMIS trustees, Charlie Bird, OBE, who will be joining us and sharing a very personal perspective of a survivor. Before we begin, I just want to deal with some quick housekeeping items. All participants will be placed on mute for the duration of the webinar, but please feel free to use our chat function to make any comments or to post any questions that you may have. And what we will do at the end of the session, at the end of all the speakers' presentations, is we will select a couple of questions, hopefully time allowing, that we can ask our delegates. If we can't answer all the questions, we will create a Q&A and publish that on our website, along with a video recording of today's webinar, so that you can review and share as you see fit after the event. Also, please feel free to visit our website at amis.org.uk for further information. There's also some knowledge sharing information that you might find of interest after this event. We are also on Twitter and Facebook if you want to look us up. So without any further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Elizabeth Bates.
Thank you very much, Bev. That was a very kind introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this event. It's really exciting. I'm just going to share my screen, hopefully, which I'm hoping you can see. Please shout if not. So yeah, my name's Liz. I'm from the University of Cumbria, and with some colleagues, I do work around men's experiences of domestic violence. And what I was wanting to present today is just quite a brief sort of overview of some of the key issues that have been seen within my work and the work of others. And it includes talking just a little bit about what we know about men's experiences so far of domestic abuse, thinking a little bit about how these experiences can change and continue post-separation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the barriers to help seeking, and then link in with some of the work that I've done with AMIS about their the engagement of their people that contact the service. And really the sort of summary and some of the conclusions, not to give you a spoiler, is just around the importance of the need for this gender inclusive service, and one that supports men in this really important way. So just to really just give a bit of context to give you an idea of why men's experiences have not always been explored. The feminist movement of the 1970s can be really strongly credited with bringing about awareness of the issue of domestic violence, and it should be credited with that. One of the issues that they took up in their sort of campaigning was violence against women, and it was about focusing on stopping wife abuse and marital rape. Because the nature of obviously the way in which this movement came about, and obviously the agenda that the feminist movement had in terms of tackling things like gender inequality, it means that quite a lot of that early research and the models that came out of this area were quite gendered. So they focused on men's violence towards women, seeing it as a function of patriarchy and male privilege and ultimately gender inequality. So these models were very prevalent within the literature base in that those early days, and as a consequence they became really influential within research, policy and practice. And you may be familiar with the Duluth model, which came out of America in the it was one of the sort of key and certainly most well-known models that has really put this model into practice. So what this did is, as I say, it can be really credited with us being able to actually talk about domestic violence in a much stronger way, because actually pre-1970s, it happened in the home and that was private and we just didn't talk about it. So it's really important to sort of credit them with the ways in which we now talk about it more as an issue, and such a significant amount of work that's been done since. The downside of it being the focus being on gender in that sense, though, is that what it did, all that focus became on one particular perpetrator group and one particular victim group. And what it meant was that the research that we had focused on adult heterosexual male perpetrators and adult heterosexual female victims. And one of the things that we've started to recognise over the last sort of 10 to 15 years in particular, I think, is the ways in which this almost created out groups, which we've sort of Julie Taylor, my colleague, and I who've done this work have sort of loosely called it. So we call them out groups because what it means is they've just not received the same amount of attention in the research and so in policy and practice as well. And obviously the focus of what I'm talking about today is male victims, adult male victims. But obviously the other groups that you can see here, these are groups that have not received the same attention, and we are still needing to do more work to sort of explore and raise awareness around. So the research that's developed over the last 50 years has given us a much better insight into the issue generally of domestic violence. But the picture that I've got on there, I just wanted to include because whilst a lot of the research that was done in the 1970s onwards focused, as I say, on male perpetrators and women victims, we see reference to male victims of abuse quite significantly before that. And this picture, if anybody's heard me talk before, I always use it because I just think it's really interesting, is the picture of the charivari, which was a post-Renaissance custom that was used to publicly humiliate and punish a man who had allowed his wife to beat him, because it was seen as threatening the order of patriarchy. So we see these references to male victims historically, and yet despite obviously this, we just didn't talk about it within the research as much. But the development of what we call act-based measures, so rather than working just specifically with men in prisons and perpetrator programs and women in shelters and victim services, when you asked people in the community generally about experiences within the relationship, we started to see that domestic violence impacted on all sorts of victim groups, was actually probably more common than people realise, and had really significant impacts as well. So over the last 10 to 15 years in particular, there's been research that's explored male victims' experiences in much more depth. So we know now that men experience significant physical abuse, verbal aggression, sexual abuse. There's lots of different types of abuse that they experience. We know that they also experience psychological and emotional abuse and are victims of coercive control, which again is something that we haven't typically thought of, or certainly the research didn't necessarily talk about, because that controlling behaviour aspect was something that happened to women and was related to the idea of patriarchy. But we know now that men experience really significant psychological and emotional abuse. We also know that they experience something that is, well, we know more about some of the more potentially gender-specific experiences that they have in terms of things like legal and administrative aggression. So as a type of abuse, this is seen where, in this instance, I'm talking about women, will use legal and administrative systems to then use it as an additional mechanism of coercive control. And we think that it's something that men tend to experience more than women because of the nature of the ways that services have been set up, which means that women know that it's more geared to supporting them as victims. And so actually they can use that as a tool of manipulation sometimes. We also know that there are really significant impacts to physical and mental health of the abuse that men experience. And again, there's research that has suggested that. And more recently, we've started to work with practitioners to understand their experiences and perspectives of supporting men within services. And that's a reference to quite a recent paper that's come out. We see that for what I'm talking about particularly today is research of research with male victims of female perpetrated violence. But we're also seeing more understanding now about gay, bisexual and trans men as well within the literature. So we do have a greater understanding of this now. So just to kind of give you an idea of some of the sorts of things that men have reported in this research, this is an example of some data from one of my published studies. And these are just some incidents of verbal and physical aggression. So I saw within the data that I had that men reported really significant instances of physical and aggression in particular. Again, the perceptions I think we have around domestic violence, and probably as well related very much to our perceptions around gender, mean that we think that men are big and tough and strong and so can defend themselves, but also that women are typically smaller and typically weaker and so wouldn't be able to cause damage. But we certainly saw significant injuries associated with this aggression in my research. They were tended to, I shouldn't say it like that, but there were some instances on several occasions within the data where men were talking about being attacked when they were vulnerable. So for example, when they were asleep or in the shower. But there were also instances where men were talking about their wives or partners or girlfriends using objects and weapons to really kind of, I suppose potentially in some ways to address that size and strength imbalance. There were then significant amounts with every man that took part talked about the psychological, emotional and coercive control aspect. So for some, it was talking about the ways in which she had tried to control their basic freedom, so had control of their activities, who he was talking to, who he was seeing, and sometimes would pester and harass until it became no longer fun to try and do anything without them. So these are just some quotes that kind of really give you an idea of that. There's also manipulation and isolation. So we see this a lot around the ways in which they'd become isolated from friends and family through that control, using the children and things as well. We're seeing quite a lot here. Manipulation of behaviour through threats to the children as well was also seen. And there was a lot around denigration and humiliation, so constant put downs, constant criticism, constant verbal abuse in this form. So things like, as you can see here, jealousy, name calling, but also the mechanisms like stopping a man from going to sleep, making fun of them, saying that the child wasn't his, things like that. So again, just really significant ways in which as I say, the woman in the research that I've done was manipulating this. And the impact of these experiences was really significant for the men involved. So some of them talked about really significant mental and physical health impacts in terms of injuries, but also in terms of the way in which their health had declined. Mental health problems around things like depression and anxiety, but also quite significant and sometimes clinical level trauma like PTSD. And some men had talked about trying to take their own life or thinking about it and having suicidal thoughts because it was just, you know, they couldn't see any other way out of what they were experiencing. And as that bottom quote as well on the slide sort of shows as well, that the impact in terms of after the end of the relationship, but they were so isolated that they'd lost a lot of their social connections. So one of the ways in which I think we still don't understand a huge amount about men's experiences is seen through how their abuse can continue and change post-separation. So for women, we know within the women's literature where there's been more research on this, that the end of the relationship can be quite a dangerous time. So there's the risk of escalation, often thought to be caused by the trigger potentially of the rejection of the end of that relationship. But we also see it through research that's demonstrated stalking and harassment behaviours that women have experienced as well. But what we know from some of the general social survey data, so this the stats that I've got there come from a Canadian survey, we know that 40% of women and 32% of men reported that some violence had occurred after the end of the relationship. So for those who had experienced it within the relationship, it had, they talked about the ways in which it had continued after. And for 24% of those who had reported that there was a post-separation abuse experienced, 24% had said that the violence had escalated, and that Zoom thing is in the way. I think it was 39%. Yeah, 39% said that it had only begun after the end of the relationship as well. So the other ways in which we know that men can experience abuse in some ways after the end of the relationship is through some of the stalking literature. So the stalking literature suggests that the most common type of stalker is an ex-partner. So I suppose in contrast to some of people's perceptions and stereotypes about stalking, that imagine it's strangers sort of loitering and following, actually ex-partners are the most common type. And so when we look at stalking by partners and ex-partners, we see that it affects men and women, as you can see from the numbers on the slide there. And for every 4 victims of stalking, 3 are female and 1 are male. And where we've looked at men's experiences of stalking more broadly within the sort of ONS and crime survey data, we can see that 32% of the perpetrators of male stalking victims are partners or ex-partners, and it's not a totally dissimilar proportion to that for women. So after I've done some of the work that I've just kind of shown you some quotes from, one of the things that come up quite a lot was this idea of it continuing after the end of the relationship. And so I did a follow-up small-scale study that interviewed 13 men and asked about these experiences. And many of them, in this sample, they talked about the fact that the violence, the physical side of it, had stopped, but that there was continued exertion of coercion through different mechanisms, including harassment, making false allegations, and manipulating the relationship with the child. So I did a follow-up study with my colleague Julie Taylor from the University of Cumbria as well, and 2 of our students, and we explored the ways in which this occurred within a wider sample. So we had an anonymous online survey of 130 men that took part, and that anonymity we feel is really important to facilitate some men's disclosure, because we know that that's something that that anonymity is important when men are help seeking as well. So it separated our themes into these different areas. I'm not going to obviously talk about them all tonight, but there was significant experiences of pre-separation abuse, and then the ways in which it continued after. And then you can see the list there of the different impacts that it had and the multifaceted way in which it impacted on them. And also kind of we looked at the help-seeking experiences as well. So these are just some quotes that I've lifted from a couple of the themes. This covers really some of the post-separation physical violence and control that they experienced. So physical violence that included quite significant injurious violence, but also involved, as you can see in the first quote, children when they were there too. The coercive control element can just be seen slightly within these quotes as well, as in, not slightly, you can definitely see it, but I mean, it's just a small couple of examples really. The whole data set was absolutely full of this type of behaviour, but just 2 specific examples include the threat there in that first one of what would be false allegations, and the threat that was continued, it was used to continue that exertion of control over his behaviour. And also you can see the sort of stalking type and harassment behaviour of being able to sort of see that she was logging into his accounts and things as well. And again, the impact of this was really significant, as you can imagine. It seemed to have almost, not that you could say it was worse than experiencing pre-separation violence, obviously, but it seemed to almost have a hopelessness to it that occurred as well, because all of them, after all that time of abuse within the relationship, and then finally being able to leave the relationship, but all of this abuse was continuing, and for some of them it was for years afterwards as well. So the impact of that was really, really significant for them. Again, there were men talking about thinking about or trying to take their own life, the fear that there was within their day-to-day life, because they could not bear the thought of being involved with her again, and that they were frightened that she was still going to try and get in touch with them. And for those that were children, it would seem, I would say, probably hands down, the most painful part of it was not seeing their children where that was the case. And the one aspect that I hadn't really considered quite as much as I should have done it maybe, but I certainly have now with the data, was the ways in which it impacted on the wider members of the family. So I'd obviously focused pretty much within the questions and within the way that I'd asked them about the impact on him as a father, him as a victim or survivor or someone who's experienced this, as well as the impact it might have had on his children or any new partners. But what I also saw within this data set particularly was the ways in which there was an impact of not seeing extended family that he'd been used to seeing. So for this example here, he missed his stepchildren that he had no rights obviously to try and get contact of. But also where there was alienation and manipulation of that parental relationship. Again, I'd focused on asking about how it had impacted on him and his perception of how it had impacted on the children. But there were quite a few accounts of the ways in which this pain had rippled through the family. So actually that the children had become alienated, not only from the father, but from the whole of the father's side of the family as well. So again, it was really powerful data, that really powerful stories that we're seeing here. And so in a different study that I've been doing with somebody at the University of West London, Dr. Ben Hine, we wanted to explore this manipulation of the parental relationship in a bit more detail. So what we saw within the study that we did, which was exploring fathers' experiences of alienation or withholding of contact from their children, was there were different mechanisms in which this occurred. So for some men, it was genuinely just withholding contact, that they were not able to get access and they hadn't seen their children for several years. For this man, as you can see here, for 9 years. There was also the ways in which it was manipulated before the end of the relationship. So some of the men talked about the ways they could see that she was trying to manipulate that relationship before it had finished. So again, that second quote highlights the ways in which she was trying to turn the child against the dad potentially, even before the end of the relationship. And there were also ways which I found particularly upsetting as well, in the ways in which the children had become a part of it, but in terms of almost a responsibility for the other parent, for the mother. So this quote here, as you can see, but also I remember reading one where he said, my daughter says that she can't always come and see me because mummy cries when I'm not there. So the idea that actually the child has been affected, that relationship's affected because the child's feeling responsible for the other parent. And so again, when we looked at the types of behaviours that we're seeing, we could see that there was like geographical almost withholding of contact by disappearing with the children until the police had found them, so that he just couldn't know where they were and he didn't know how to find them. Control of the contact that there is. So for example, in that second quote there, you can see that it's an example of the ways in which the mothers in this instance, because I do absolutely recognise that parental alienation occurs by fathers to mothers too, but obviously my data is just focusing on fathers' experiences. But the ways in which she would then book in activities or sleepovers or things like that, so that actually when it was his time, they weren't available, but if he challenged that, she would threaten to seize contact. Breaches of court orders and family court orders and contact arrangements and all this sort of thing was seen really significantly throughout, with very little penalty, which was one of the issues. So there was very little deterrent for women not to do this in this instance. And one, again, of the ways that I found particularly upsetting was the ways in which she had tried to affect his identity as a dad and how their children saw him. So it included, say, like calling him by his first name, telling the children to call him by his first name, removing that whole notion of dad as an identity almost. And as this example shows, sometimes assigning that to a new man, which obviously was particularly painful. And so to kind of bring it onto the barriers to help seeking, this is from that post-separation study I've just talked about. When it comes to looking at the barriers to help seeking, many of the men just want someone to talk to, but importantly for them, someone who believes them. And in a situation where obviously some men fear not being believed, potentially through having experienced either the threat of or actual false allegations, or having become involved in the criminal justice system in that way because of that, or because they have reached out to services or friends and family before and they haven't been believed, or they've been laughed at, or there's been some sort of reaction that has then made them not want to ever tell anybody ever again. Many of the men just want to be able to talk to somebody and find somebody that believes them. And so these barriers to help seeking can be seen through a number of different mechanisms, and they include the ways in which, generally speaking, across any victim group, domestic violence is talked about as a stigmatised identity. And with many of the literature-based help seeking models, the idea of it being a stigmatised identity can be really seen. The fact that the stereotypes and some of the language still typically will talk about victims as women and men as perpetrators, and the very powerful, as I said, long-standing gender discourse that exists around policy, practice and funding. So, for example, within England and Wales, obviously where I'm based, there is the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, which is where domestic abuse sits underneath that sort of umbrella strategy. So for some men, it looks like and it feels like they can't be part of that because they don't fit under that. So what we kind of interpret in some ways is that these factors combine to sometimes almost trebly stigmatise help seeking for men's victimisation, so that they feel trebly stigmatised almost in that way. And where we have seen literature that's explored how they have experienced help seeking, they talk about sometimes sources being unhelpful or unavailable or seemingly inappropriate. That some men talk about experiencing gender stereotypes treatment through, for example, being accused of being a perpetrator, being assumed to be the perpetrator because they're male, sometimes being referred to perpetrator or batterer programs. And this can create what Campbell calls a secondary victimisation. So where a victim is encountering services and help and support or the criminal justice system in whatever way, and that they're victimised in an additional way, which then can actually compound the trauma that they experience. And so some of the research that Julie and I have done has explored that, and we've seen that very much in our own literature, in our own research, in our own data, the ways in which the barriers can really impact on their health and well-being, and the way that the responses to their initial help seeking can sometimes be further exclusion, further isolation, and feeling further discredited. But there are some stories that have sort of talked about the ways in which services have been helpful and the mechanisms of which that has occurred. And that really brings me on to the work that I've done with AMIS in terms of understanding people who have contacted them and how it has impacted on them. As I say, men face similar barriers to help seeking as all of those that I've just described then. When I asked the men in this survey, sorry, I probably should have added that bit. We did an anonymous online survey to capture feedback from people who had engaged with AMIS. And they faced a lot of similar barriers to those that I've just described then. They faced a lot of barriers that were related to their own perception of their victimisation, but also of their perception of what people would think about it. But the feedback from people who had contacted AMIS was overwhelmingly positive. It was all positive in the survey data that we had. They talked and used words like that they could speak and have their voice heard without any judgment, that they talked through the options, that they felt safe in talking to it. They said things like that they were just really glad that they were there. And then one of the obviously most powerful ones that I've used as the title of this talk was that this man credited as having saved his life because of what he was experiencing and the help that he got from them. And so I think to really just kind of highlight this, these are some quotes from the men that really highlight the importance of this particular service, this very gender inclusive service that supports men in a very gender responsive way. And for some, you can see that they really felt like actually the first call made the difference. And I think that that's seen within other accounts and other help seeking information that we do have, that the first reaction to a man's disclosure can be really important in terms of either how he progresses that, who else he tells, and how he continues or considers leaving the relationship. So having a supportive first response in that way, having been heard and believed and listened to, is really important for men, and that's what they got from this service. They liked that it was focused on men. They liked that it was focused in that way that meant that they felt that they were heard and that it was responding to them specifically. They didn't feel like they were being judged or that they were going to be accused of anything. This was seen within the calls that they made, but also in the ways in which they engaged with things like the website and social media as well. So they quickly realised that this was a supportive service and that they were going to be supported there. And that, as you can see from one of those quotes there, the website and social media appearance was what meant that man could pick up the phone. The helpline was really supportive. So they could call from work. And importantly, for this one in particular, I think, was that it was based in Scotland and that it was Scottish and that it was the only one that they could find for him as a man based in that area. And some men did talk about the ways in which they'd actually contacted other organisations and that they hadn't had as positive a response, but that they had really only got what they needed from AMIS. They didn't feel like they were being blamed. They didn't feel like they were being judged, and just how important that was for the men that were calling this service. And the vulnerability that these men experience and the sort of the challenges they face in contacting services and telling people about it, to have such a positive response, it had such a positive impact on them, and that could be seen through every single man's account in the way in which they contacted and talked about this. So I'm going to end on that note, and I believe you're now going to hear from Iris. I think he's going to talk to you more about that. I'll let somebody else introduce her formally though, but I just wanted to say thank you very much for listening. Obviously, if you ask any questions you have in the chat later, if you'd like to, and there is my email address and my Twitter if anybody would like to get in touch with me at a later date. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Liz. We really appreciate that. That was very informative. Thank you. And now, and Liz, please hang around for questions. Thanks. And now I would like to introduce you to Iris Kwa, our Services Manager for AMIS.
Hi, everybody. As Bev has just told you, I'm Iris. I'm the Services Manager at AMIS. And if you just give me a second to share my screen, we'll get underway with this presentation. Okay, so I'm very glad and very proud to have this opportunity to talk to you today about AMIS and to draw for you a picture of the issues around male victims and of intimate partner violence as it presents itself to us at AMIS. We'll be looking at the issues men deal with around the support available, or well, more correctly, the lack of support for male victims, the barriers to help seeking, the kinds of abuse that men suffer, and the impact it has on them, their children, and their extended families. We'll finish off with a case study of a recent client, which will demonstrate that the very big difference that can be made, you know, from a moderate amount of help being received. So, one of the first things that we should talk about is what is AMIS? And we're a small charity, which is in the main privately funded. We've never received any public funding to pay for the frontline services that we offer. We rely entirely on private trusts and foundations to keep the doors open, and spirited individuals and teams who take part in fundraising events and make personal donations, all of which we are truly grateful for. We're celebrating our 10th anniversary this year, and we're looking forward to the next 10 years. We hope that the difference we have made in the past will continue for the individuals and grow considerably for the nation as a whole. What we offer at AMIS is a helpline service with the option to receive ongoing support, either by telephone, email or video. We also offer training and awareness raising events to the public and professionals. Over the years, we've built up a network of opportunities. We've built onward networking opportunities to establish a presence within areas of law, policy and practice to allow us to advocate on behalf of all male victims and their children to make sure that their voices are heard. People who have come into contact with AMIS and the work that we do are quite often surprised when they find out just how compact an organisation we are. But we managed to cover the whole of Scotland and receive calls from every one of Scotland's 32 local authorities. This year we've been contacted by 450 new clients. The initial telephone conversation can sometimes take up to 2 hours just to give the man the support that he needs to validate the fact of what he's suffering and to go through what his needs are, dice it all down, try to create a programme where he can make the differences in his life that he chooses to make, leave time for discussion. That can take up to 2 hours to happen during that first phone call. There are some very complex cases which need ongoing support at each stage of that process. Some men like to stay in touch to be able to keep us up to speed, to discuss things further, to talk about developments. So it takes around 1,200 contacts this year to deliver the ongoing support that's needed. At any one time, we have a caseload of around 350 clients receiving ongoing support. As a result of COVID-19 this year, we've seen an increase of around 25% on the amount of work that we usually do, and the same increase in the number of men that we help. What we've found is that COVID is complicating things and making issues more complex as a result of the lockdown rules that people are living under. Male victims of abuse often experience persistent homelessness, a constant struggle to maintain a relationship with their children, and false allegations or threats of false allegations of perpetrating abuse. It's so much easier to believe that a big, strong man is the perpetrator rather than a woman. But these allegations or threats of allegations are made by their abusive partner as a means of controlling the male victim. Men are often seen as capable of looking after themselves, strong, resilient, and in control. But for any of us, sometimes situations arise where we're powerless, weak, and vulnerable. Partner abuse is one of these situations, regardless of your gender. Whoever you are, you can find yourself giving your love and trust to someone who is an abuser. We would all be vulnerable to abuse in that situation. More research of the kind presented here today by Dr. Elizabeth Bates needs to be done. We need to understand more about male victimisation and how to support men and boys. There are examples in other spheres of this sort of reporting bias that men suffer from in the domestic abuse field. For example, a recently published joint research project by Barnardo's Scotland and the Scottish Children's Reporter Administration, they found that 80% of boys compared to 25% of girls that were identified by the research team as likely victims of sexual exploitation were not identified in official reports as being victims. This suggests that boys' vulnerabilities to sexual exploitation are not being recognised or they're not being taken seriously, and it also means that the extent of child sexual exploitation is much greater than we know. And we're finding the same with male victims of domestic abuse. We find that they're not being recognised. We find that they're not being taken seriously. And it does also mean that the situation is, the prevalence of it is much higher than we already know just now. Partner abuse can destroy or even end lives. We've all seen the horrendous reports of femicide by male perpetrators on the television and in the press. But on the other hand, on a trip to a Scottish prison, I was told that there were 11 inmates in a unit for female life prisoners. 10 of them were incarcerated for killing their male partners. A chilling statistic, whatever the circumstances. I couldn't find any information to explain the circumstances of any of these deaths. I would have expected to find something, giving an account of such individually rare but prevalent cases for this group. And another situation that we often think about is we speak to so many men who have considered or attempted suicide as a result of the abuse that they're suffering. And we need to find out if there's any correlation between the high rates of male abuse and, the high rates of male suicide and the number of men who are suffering partner abuse. Research shows that children who live in abusive homes have a greater chance of being in an abusive relationship in adulthood, either as a victim or a perpetrator. Statistics show that many victims, regardless of gender, feel shame and are reluctant to report abuse. But given societal perceptions of abuse victims, men face extra barriers in relation to being believed, or as Dr. Bates was telling us, being believed or being treated like perpetrators. And men are not wanting to see their relationship with their children destroyed. And this is going to happen, they're worried, if they seek to have their abuser prosecuted. So there's lots of extra considerations there for male victims of domestic abuse and exactly what they're going to do about it. And now we come to the case study. I always think that there's nothing sort of drives the point home more than actually looking at someone that this has happened to, someone who's experienced this. I know there's a number of people attending this event tonight who have got first-hand knowledge, and this is probably going to resonate with them. We had a man who contacted us. He was very upset and distressed and cried more than once during that first telephone conversation. He had been emotionally and physically abused and controlled for most of his married life. He went out to work, and he looked after the home and the children, and that was his life. That was entirely his life. He began to suffer from PSD. It was diagnosed by his doctor. PTSD, I beg your pardon. He eventually lost his job due to his severe mental health issues, and that was caused by the domestic abuse. And he became a full-time housekeeper and primary carer of the children. At enormous cost to himself and his own well-being, he stayed to protect the children and to maintain his relationship with them. And the abuse was the price that he paid, and the PTSD was the price that he paid for wanting to stay with the children. But he contacted us when the children had grown up, and he realised that he could leave. He told us that he remembered wanting to leave over the years, for many years, but didn't know how to make it work. And when we started to speak to him and dice down his situation, we could see that he was very confused, very low in self-esteem. After the years of abuse, he had been left with no decision-making skills, no support network, no money, rent arrears in his sole name, and other household debts in his sole name as well. And he was sleeping rough in his car in a secluded area near his home. He called us because he didn't want to give in and go back. He really felt that he wouldn't be able to live if he'd went back to his home with his wife. He had seriously considered suicide rather than doing that. He was returning home when his wife was at work to charge up his phone so that he could speak to us and to shower. And he was usually very hungry when he went to the house, but he didn't dare eat anything because then she would know that he'd been in. And he was terrified that she would come home and find him and report him to the police or try to make something sinister out of the fact that he was in the house. So what we did with this man was we offered him the intensive sort of short-term emotional support and practical support that we could after we'd discussed his problems. And again, he was very taken by the fact that we believed him and that we could validate what was going on for him, and talk about it seriously, like the real problem that it was. And we helped him to reconnect with his family and friends. And we gave him information about the Matrimonial Homes Act, which said that he had the right to be in the house and she couldn't keep him out. But he had no interest whatsoever in being in the house. And we're very much a client-led organisation, so we put that to one side, and we called the housing authority on his behalf and arranged an appointment explaining his situation so that it would be a bit easier for him to then go in and speak to someone. We put him in touch with a food bank, debt and benefits advice, a local advocacy worker who would be prepared to go to meetings with him, a local domestic abuse service who were able to support male victims, an organisation who we have spent quite a bit of time nurturing a good relationship with in order to help them to support male victims. And also is the local Police Scotland Domestic Abuse Liaison Officer, so that he could take some advice and receive information from them too on the fact that he was so worried that his wife was going to phone the police on him at some point. So that was what we did for this man over the course of a few weeks. And he was set up with the help that he was going to get from these more specialist services that we were, not able to do, like attending meetings with them. I would have loved to attend the meetings with them, but we just don't have the capacity to be able to do that kind of thing. But I like to think that we're a one-stop shop and we can find people everything that they need, or most things that they need, to try and benefit their situation. And this was one of these men who has said that he probably wouldn't be here if it wasn't for AMIS now. And I'm very glad and I feel very privileged to be in the job that I'm in and making such an impact on people's lives. And I would just like to say thank you very much for listening, and I hope that's given you a picture of who we are and what we're about, and I hope that people who are considering coming to a support service will do it, whichever one it is, but AMIS will be the one that can help you if you're a male victim of domestic abuse.
Thank you very much, Iris. A great presentation, and thank you for your dedication to our cause, and obviously you're a great asset to this organisation. Thank you. I'd like to now introduce you to Charlie Bird, OBE, who is one of our valued trustees, and he's going to be chatting to you about personal experience.
Good evening. It's very clear to me from looking at what's been going on in the chat line and various comments that people have made that there are a number of other survivors out there. What can I say? I'm glad you're here. I hope you're healing. And if you still need help, you've come to the right place. It's almost impossible if you just look at somebody without talking to them to know where they come from, where they live, what they do, what sports team, if anything, they support, what their political or religious beliefs might be. And it's exactly the same with an abuser and a victim. Just meeting somebody you can't know, you can't tell. Anybody has the potential to be a victim of domestic abuse. And so before I say anything else, if there is anyone watching or listening, either live or on the recording, who thinks that they might be in an abusive relationship, whether physical, emotional, or psychological, please talk to someone. Find help. Seek advice. But don't just endure. Because your situation won't change. Your partner won't change. You cannot, no matter what you believe, change them. The longer the abusive situation and atmosphere continues, the more dangerous it is for you, your partner, and any children who might be involved. And I'm not just talking about male victims of domestic abuse. All such abuse is wrong, irrespective of the gender, sexual orientation, ethnic origin, religion or none, or social status of the perpetrator or victim. And although AMIS exists primarily to help male victims and survivors of domestic abuse, we're not exclusive. It's not an us or them situation or competition. As I said, all domestic abuse is wrong, and we are happy and willing to work with others to highlight the issue of domestic abuse and to help the victims and the survivors. But we're here to talk about AMIS and the issue of male victims of domestic abuse here in Scotland. In 1971, the first women's refuge was opened in London. And nearly 50 years later, domestic abuse against women is still happening. But at least, thank goodness, The issue is out in the open. Society is sympathetic to the victims. There is government funding for refugees, information campaigns, counselling. It even figures in prime time soap operas. But 50 years and it's still an issue? And I've got 8 minutes to talk about what still seems to be a taboo subject, male victims of domestic abuse. It's not something that gets talked about or gets covered in the media or, crucially, gets much funding. And this despite the fact that Police Scotland statistics show that in recent years, male victims of female perpetrators run at an annual rate of between 16 to 20% of all reported domestic abuse cases. Not only are the police aware of the problem, but so are the medical profession, counsellors, social services, and to a certain extent, the legal profession. They all see the reality of male victims and survivors of domestic abuse, but society seems to want to look the other way for some reason. How long do you think before it's a main storyline in EastEnders or The Archers? But it's real. And I know because I'm a survivor. And I found Liz's presentation really painful to listen to. Now, I'm not going to go into details of my situation out of respect to my former partner who wrestled with demons and problems that I wouldn't wish on anybody, and who has sought and found the appropriate help on her road to recovery. And for that, I'm glad. But that wasn't always the case. No one walks into the middle of an abusive relationship and stays. I didn't. And it's important to recognize that the same is true irrespective of the gender of either victim or perpetrator. If the first time you meet someone, they hit you, belittle you, or try to manipulate you, you wouldn't go back. Abuse, in whatever form, creeps up on you once the relationship is established. There are odd incidents, attitudes and behaviours that to start with appear out of character. You accept them. You excuse them. You normalise them. The incidents increase, but by this time you've invested so much, including financially, into the relationship, that the alternative to staying and enduring seems impossible. And if you love your partner and abuser, which often is the case, you keep on making excuses for them. Keep on believing that things will get better, no matter how outrageous the behavior, and that you can bring about the change. You become experts at keeping the real situation literally in-house and hidden from the rest of the world. If children are involved, they can become part of the conspiracy, until one day the unacceptable becomes not only accepted, but expected. And you may not even be aware of it. In my case, it took a shocking incident which brought in the authorities to break the cycle and give a safe space in which to be helped to understand what had been going on, to recover, and eventually to heal. I was hugely fortunate to have been pointed in the direction of AMIS, who are the only organisation dedicated to helping male victims of domestic abuse in Scotland. And it's a hard thing to accept that you have been in an abusive relationship. I can remember resisting fiercely the whole idea when the police and social services first suggested but I'm white, educated, middle class, and well-travelled. I'd never allow myself to get into that sort of relationship, was my response. It was only when I was helped to look back with opened eyes that I was able to accept the notion of having been in an abusive relationship, and in a sense of having allowed it to continue to the detriment of all concerned. But that acceptance was the start of the healing process. And that's why I come back to my original point. If you're in a similar situation to the one that I was in, find someone to talk to. Don't wait until it's too late. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Much appreciated. Very hard to talk about, I'm sure. Right, so thank you to our wonderful presenters. If you could put yourselves, you turn your cameras on, please, and unmute yourselves. And then we can have a go at answering some of the questions that were put to us, if that's okay. Right, I have one for Iris. Iris, are you there?
Yes,
Thank you. Okay, well, the question that was on the chat for you was, why do men need their own domestic abuse service?
I think that answer can be divided into two parts. I think because we're like abused men in Scotland, because we're in Scotland, there's a different legal system, different political system, different rules for COVID just now, different, you know, regulations and rules for what you can do, where you can go. All of those kind of things means that we have to have, you know, like a Scottish-based system. I think also because only if it's sort of based in Scotland will we have the information and the networking opportunities with other Scottish charities, other Scottish organisations to do the best that can be done to support the men. So I think that's one part of it, is that we need to have something in Scotland. The other part of it is that we need to have something that's specifically for men, because men have so many other issues that are different to the issues that women suffer. Lots of the issues that are suffered through partner abuse are common to all sufferers of partner abuse. Some of them have a different emphasis, you know, for men and for women and for some other people. They have different emphasis on the issue that's at hand. And some of them are almost entirely or exclusively situations that men find themselves in. The examples are the ones that we've been talking about tonight, you know, like trying to maintain a relationship with their children, and false allegations being made. These are things that men have to deal with specifically. There's also that whole issue about the society that we live in, the way we view men and women, the way we view gender, and how important gender seems to be to people in certain types of situations. And men have to deal with that as well. You know, there's a very female-centric way of dealing with domestic abuse, and we have to shine a light on the issues that men are dealing with and the support that they need.
Thank you. A question for Liz that we got from one of the participants, if that's okay, is have you shared these findings with governments, Liz, Scotland and the UK? And the comment was, there are huge issues for men who access helplines and services who seek to evaluate their experience and judge them on occasion to be perpetrators. And the concern was, you know, this is a huge issue, and how are we making this visible to the powers that be?
That's a good question. More so, I've tried to do this probably more so in England and Wales, where I was based, and obviously where Mankind is based as well. But I've tried and have tried to sort of try and get my findings into that area. I've submitted evidence when there's been committees and things like that. And I try and get asked to things where I would be able to talk about it and share the sort of the words of the men that I've worked with to try and have an input. I haven't been as successful as I would like to have been, and there are lots of different barriers to that, I'm sure. But I would like to try and do that more, if I'm honest. And if anybody is aware of any opportunities where there would be people in those positions to be open to hearing a bit more about sort of the work that's done in this area, I'd be really willing to share.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Right, and I have another question for Iris. Does AMIS take calls from people outside of Scotland?
We take calls from people outside of Scotland. We never refuse any call to start with. We'll always try and find someone. If we're not the best person to help someone who's called, we'll always try and find someone else who is the right person to help them, because we're connected and networked into lots of other organisations. We can usually find someone to help, whatever the issue might be. What we find sometimes is that we'll get calls from family and friends, you know, concerned people who are worried about a man who lives in Scotland who's suffering abuse. So we will help people from anywhere who are concerned about a man who lives in Scotland, and where we would have, you know, like a valuable input for that man to be helped.
Great, thank you. And I have a question for Alison. Alison, are you there? Alison is one of our founding fathers of the charity, founding mothers. And she is with us today as a co-host. Thank you for everything that you've done, Alison. I have a quick question that was posed. What do you believe, in your experience, obviously you've had 10 years of supporting the charity and being really involved in providing services and helping us to do that. What is the best way to stop post-separation abusive behaviour in your view?
Oh my goodness.
Sorry.
That's a big question.
Tricky one.
How to stop it? I think it has to be acknowledged before it can be stopped. I think the narrative out there, it's well known that women can suffer greatly and be in great danger if they leave a relationship, but it's not so well known what can happen to men if they leave a relationship. And Liz has covered quite a few of these things today, so I don't need to repeat them all. I think there's a huge amount of awareness needing to be raised, and people have to be open-minded about it and listen. You know, whatever their beliefs, whatever their own experience has been, they really need to listen to this research and yeah. And then once people understand, I think one of the biggest issues, and well, all abuse really, is the importance of each incident or series of incidents being properly investigated, because we've been talking about false allegations, and we know that the women's organisations are very concerned about allegations that we say men might say are false, they believe are true. There's a lot on both sides. Men and women are capable of exaggerating, telling untruths. So the importance of investigation is key, I think, to all of this. We should never automatically believe one person against another because of stereotypical reasons. We need to check in depth and then deal with it, whoever the victim is. And also the perpetrator is most usually a person who needs help, and that should be available too.
Great, thank you. Definitely changing the narrative, you know, getting people talking about this and making it more people accepting the fact that this is not simply a gender issue. So, yeah. Another one for you, Alison, please, is somebody asked, what is AMIS's relationship with Women's Aid at this time?
We have a very good relationship with quite a number of the branches of Women's Aid, and we're delighted to say that some men who have come to us have been signposted from a Women's Aid branch. And I have known I've heard directly from a man, or more than one, who has been helped by a Women's Aid branch. We are not in regular contact with Scottish Women's Aid. We are always open to communication, but that doesn't happen.
Yeah, well, we'll work on it. So,
we've been working on it.
We'll continue to do that.
We keep trying.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So unless anybody has any final comments from the panelists, I think that, or if you have anything
Charlie?
anything that you'd like to.
Charlie?
I think the only thing I would kind of reinforce is that I think Iris mentioned something about, here's to the next 10 years. I would love it if in 10 years' time, neither Women's Aid nor AMIS existed, because there wasn't any need for us. It would be great. And I really look forward to the day when we don't have to segregate, if you like, the issue of perpetrators and victims by gender or by anything else. That there's just an understanding within society that if these things happen, and they do, then they're to be condemned, and we should all be working to stamp out all forms of abuse, all forms of abuse. I haven't met any survivor who hasn't been scarred, and it doesn't matter, what their background or origin or gender or ethnicity is. There are no winners, and society is the loser.
Thank you. Quite right. Thank you. So, anything further from any of the panelists? Thank you very much for your participation, everyone, and a special thank you for our panelists who've put a great deal of effort and time into preparing and obviously turning up today to share with us. And much obliged, and have a very good evening and good night to you all.